Welcome back. Thanks for joining us for our daily Bible study. We call it Two Steps Forward, and we're up to episode 88 and Acts chapter 22. These chapters in Acts, I always sort of, in my mind, have trouble differentiating. In fact, once you get beyond Acts 17, 18, 19, it seems like a lot of stuff that's basically sort of the same. Paul before a bunch of people giving his testimony about his ministry to the Gentiles, and it's repeatedly, which in its own way serves a purpose. How do we go about giving a testimony? And that's what we're going to dig into in these next couple chapters. He shows us the right way to do it.
Is Paul going to be killed?
It remains to be seen.
He's not it was John that got to live on the island, right?
Yeah, and he didn't get to live on the island like an island tropical paradise. He was exiled, which was punishment for those that they thought were corrupting the public.
Don't you think that you would consider that a vacation?
I wouldn't be totally opposed. Exile doesn't sound terrible to me. Island exile.
Depends how friendly the
natives,
the animals are there.
Oh yeah, I don't like
the monkeys.
I don't like snakes. Monkeys I'm okay with. Big spiders I wouldn't be great with. So.
Didn't your cousin say monkeys are the most scariest of all animals?
Yeah, not my cousin.
Jeff Irwin is his cousin.
No, there is nobody named Jeff Irwin that I'm aware of. It's Steve Irwin and Jeff Corwin, and it's a long story that I'm not going to trace the history of. But yes, monkeys are very smart, and so therefore, and volatile.
And they can turn.
Yeah, they can be moody and volatile.
They sound like a lot of fun.
They sound relatable, huh? Yeah, no, we are up to, again, Acts 22. Make sure to read through your copy at home. Here is my personal paraphrase. The crowd in Jerusalem was shocked to hear that Paul was able to speak in Aramaic, and they became very silent. And which, again, it shows a Jewish credibility.
This is Hebrew or no? Is it the same thing?
It's a variation.
It's a dialect.
Yeah, a dialect of Hebrew. Paul then shared his testimony, and he explained that he is a Jew. He was born in Tarsus. He studied under so a lot of people, again, they have some awareness of him because he's kind of a celebrity, but they don't know his whole backstory. He studied under a famous rabbi named Gamaliel, which they all would have heard of. And he was even a persecutor of Christians. So this gives him background credibility with the Jews. He had obtained letters to arrest Christians in Damascus, but along the way, a light flashed from heaven, and the voice said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Again, that's Jesus identifying with his people that Saul is persecuting. His companions saw the light, but they didn't understand the voice. Saul asked what he should do, and the Lord told him to go into a house in Damascus where he had to be led by hand since he was blinded at that time from the light. God sent a man named Ananias there to teach him about Christ, and by God's command, Saul was baptized and converted to Paul, the missionary of Christ. When Paul returned to Jerusalem, he fell into a trance while praying at the temple. God told him to leave the city as the people there weren't ready for him yet. And the people there still knew him as Saul, the persecutor of persecutor of Christians. So the Lord told him he'd send Paul far away to the Gentiles. When the crowd heard all of this, they immediately began shouting that Paul deserved to be put to death. And the Roman commander ordered that Paul be taken to the barracks. Paul was flogged and interrogated, with the commander trying to figure out why they were so upset with Paul. Again, that reminds us a little bit of the story of Jesus and Pontius Pilate, and can't figure out what he's done wrong. Paul asked the centurion if it was legal to do all this to a Roman citizen who hasn't been found guilty of anything. The commander was in disbelief, understanding the trouble that he himself could face if it was discovered that he had persecuted a Roman citizen without a fair trial. All of the soldiers in his midst started to immediately flee the scene because they didn't want to be associated with that crime. The commander said he needed to figure out why the Jews hated Paul so much, and so he ordered an assembly of the Jewish Sanhedrin, that's the Jewish highest ruling body, and they brought Paul in. That's where 22 ends. Any immediate reactions? No?
No.
Okay. So
seems pretty status quo for Paul.
Yes. Yeah, but again, notice the pieces of information that he chooses to reveal and when he reveals them. The Jews hate him. he starts speaking in Aramaic and says, yes, I was a Jewish leader who studied under Gamaliel, this well-respected rabbi. And they get real silent. He allows himself to be beaten, and then he tells the Roman soldiers, yeah, I'm a Roman citizen, so you got to be careful what you do here. And they immediately start to... He's doing things that are causing harm to himself that nonetheless are humbling the people in his presence and giving him... We talked about the same thing. He did the same thing in Acts 17, where he didn't tell the Acts 16, where he didn't tell the jailer at Philippi up front that he's a Roman citizen. And therefore, it's buying him some like resource for later. All right. So first devotional thought, number 1, Paul's testimony. Every believer, we're told, is supposed to be ready to give a reason for the hope that they have. It's 1 Peter 3:15. But what exactly does that mean? What does giving a reason for the hope that you have mean? I think at the very bottom level, as a Christian, you have to be able to share what the gospel is, the good news of Jesus Christ. God sent his son in the world to save sinners. And for those who believe in him, that means eternal life and the life beyond here. However, your testimony is a little bit different. It's taking the gospel and then overlaying it upon your life, so your life details. So Jesus Christ didn't just come to die for sins in general. He came to die for my specific sins. And here's what my sins are. And he didn't just come to gift his righteousness in general. He came to gift righteousness, like fill in all the areas where I have deficits, where I lack, where I can't produce righteousness on my own. And here's all my weaknesses. Here's where he filled in the righteousness. And so it's getting very specific about the good news of Jesus for you personally. Like here's not what it means in general. Here's what it means for you personally. I think Christian couples can share this too. Like I think every Christian couple should have a testimony of God's undeserved love and his sovereign control and power in bringing us together and keeping us together and that sort of thing. But, essentially, storytelling is an essential component of your Christian witness. It's not just an exposition of here's the doctrines that I believe. It's here's the message of grace that God has provided for me. Because generally speaking, more people are more receptive to listening to compelling stories than they are to just hear your list of bullet points. Bullet points are necessary and helpful sometimes, but your story how do you tell your personal story? Jesus, in the Christian story, Jesus should always be the hero. And we should be the villain, essentially the villain, who is transformed by grace more into Christ over time. The only story I can think of quite like that is the story of the Grinch. Because the Grinch is the bad guy, but it ends with him sort of by grace, being transformed into a good guy by the end. And so, I don't know if you can think of any other stories that fall into that
who's
category.
the hero? Cindy Lou Who?
I don't know. See, it's not...
The Who is down in Whoville.
The Grinch is not the gospel, but it is a great story of transformation by grace. I always say the Christmas stories tend to be really
Beauty
good
and the
at this.
Beast. The prince was transformed by someone loving him when he didn't deserve love.
An undeserved kiss of love. Yep. So it's the bridegroom and bride imagery. I think the story of I like Christmas Carol. But so Ebenezer Scrooge is essentially redeemed. He's given a second chance. When he thinks he's falling into his grave to his death for all of his crimes, he wakes up on Christmas morning. And he's out of his mind happy because he realized, he's only received the grace of a second chance. We've received the grace, like if we just got a second chance as Christians, we would screw that up too. We've been redeemed by grace that doesn't just give us a second chance, but gives us the gift of Christ's perfect life. So we've talked about this before. Every time you hear a good and compelling story, there's always a gospel component of it that you can latch onto. So my encouragement to you is be able to work out here, without embellishing, but without diminishing, what is God's unique story of grace to you? And again, you were the villain. Not just Satan in general, but you were the villain and your sin was the villain. And Christ is the hero in laying down his life. But what specifically has he done for you? What areas has he pulled you out of? That kind of thing. Second devotional thought is the danger of familiarity. When the Lord sends, you notice that. So when Paul first converts, this is by Paul's own testimony here. He goes into Jerusalem, but he's known as Saul of Tarsus, the persecutor of Christians, who now has flipped sides and he's promoting Christ. And God says to him, you need to get out of there. These people hate you and they're not ready for you yet. Now, the fact of the matter is, they're probably not ever going to be ready for him. Either the Jews, who he had flipped away from, or the Christians, many of whom the families of he had persecuted. And we talked about this a little bit. Jesus says something similar, and Jesus never did anything wrong, but Jesus says something similar in Mark 6 when he says a prophet never finds honor in his hometown. There's something about familiarity that breeds contempt. There's something about being too close that leads to a lack of effectiveness. And I think, I sometimes, as a pastor, think, okay, I don't think that somebody who would know. We have one person in our congregation who knew me in high school. And I'm thankful that I can be his pastor. I'm thankful that he's willing to let go of the self-righteous individual I was at that time. But I think a lot of people wouldn't be able to do that. My sins, whether they were younger brother sins or older brother sins, there's a lot of people who wouldn't. I don't think, in other words, anybody who had met me and knew me prior to 25 years old, I'm I wouldn't blame them if they say, I couldn't have you as my pastor.
I knew you before then.
Well, I think sometimes you struggle to have me as your pastor too. So, but yeah, it's, by the way, this is one of the reasons that it's nice from a Christian standpoint to move into the city. Not just me, but any Christian. Because the concept of city, and small towns are like this, right? Small towns have a familiarity breed contempt attitude because everybody knows everybody, which means everybody knows everybody's mistakes. Everybody knows everybody's business. You get away with, because you have so many more people in a larger city, everybody has pasts that you just don't really know about. And so there's a helpful anonymity ministerially for a lot of people.
Okay, so this kind of goes in the conversation you and I were having about transparency.
Yeah.
Paul was obviously transparent. He had no choice, I don't think, but to be transparent about who he was before, because everyone knew who he was before.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is when you get out of your past mistakes, you maybe have more credibility with people to do ministry. So in the era of podcasting and digital media, is there a point where you only share so much, if you're only so transparent?
Yeah.
Because I am an advocate for admitting your struggles, just exactly this, a personal testimony.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a line between, can you share too much to too many people?
Helpful or hurtful? Yeah, I definitely think there's a line. Where exactly it is tough. I think my reaction to that would be today, for a long time, that the church has defaulted to not sharing enough. So I think something happened in the middle of the 20th century where Christianity largely became defined by moral living. And so when people say things like, that's not very Christian, they so closely associate Christianity with good behavior. And that's not what Christianity had. You don't have to be Christian to be moral. To be Christian is to say, I'm a sinner that is saved by grace. And so I think for a while, churches became bodies of people who are trying to cover mistakes and hide mistakes and that sort of thing. And that's not healthy.
So I heard a sermon by an older pastor, and he made some kind of general reference and Jesus has saved you from that sin and saved me from many types of sins or whatever. And then I saw him in a social situation. I said, oh, it's Sunday. What has he saved you from? And he said, that's my, something that's my, or I can't, something I can't tell you, you wouldn't look at me the same way, or that's my secret, or, and I thought, no, I'd actually probably have a little bit more respect for you, and you'd make you a little bit more applicable.
Well, that's hard to say.
If you're willing to share your mistakes and how Christ is reviewed. But, now I look back on that and I'm yes, there were some things where maybe if you told me I would be see you differently.
Yeah, I could never see you in a different way again.
Yeah.
I think that's probably true. And so I don't know that I would make a rule about it. I think transparency is necessary and discretion and context is necessary.
Yeah.
So what you have for a long time was, and I think part of what you have on social media and the millennial generation and Generation Z, essentially, older generations are shocked at how much they're willing to share their beliefs, their opinions, their pictures, how they look at it. Older generations generally look at it as oversharing. I think that's somewhat reactionary against what was perceived as a hypocritical, we're going to hide everything in our family. We're going to take family portraits where everybody's happy, even though we know, not when we're not in front of the camera, everybody's fighting with everybody. There's bitterness and hard, so it was perceived as hypocritical. And I think that's what you saw in the church for a long time, is there was this, I think part of what the church today is this reaction against perceived hypocrisy.
Yeah.
What you're saying is the flip side of that is, okay, it's probably good to share, and I agree. It's good. I would rather the church fault on the side of transparency.
Because it does help other people.
It helps other people. Confession is good for the soul. We're not saved by our perfect public image. We're saved by the righteousness of Christ. It is beneficial to others, all that stuff. I would rather we fault on that side. And yet, I also don't fault somebody for saying there's a piece of information that I think other people would look at me differently if they knew this. And therefore, Jesus has forgiven me for it. I'm done with it. And I don't mind saying that I'm a sinner and I struggle with sin. But I'm going to be discreet about what some of that past is. That's okay too. So in the realm of your testimony, so like we talked, first point was testimony, second point is danger of familiarity, which I think there is probably an overlap to some extent in those two things. And I think be discreet about it, be honest. Again, Paul is, it's already public, as you mentioned. People knew he was involved with killing Christians, and he wasn't going to live that down. So he's not proud of it, but he is honest about it. And that's good. I think especially if something's already been made known public, don't hesitate to talk about it. And I think just in general, probably for most of us, be a couple clicks more transparent about the specific sins that you struggle with. Okay? Number 3, God's continued sovereignty over Paul. The crowd is incredibly unreceptive to Paul in Jerusalem. The Roman leaders intervene. We talked about that yesterday, similar situation, kind of thing when he's at the temple. They find out that, they beat him up and flog him without a fair trial. And yet that earns Paul some clout with so the Roman soldiers are essentially at that point a little bit indebted to Paul because they've beaten him up illegally and they're afraid that he's going to tattle on them. And so they're all of a sudden more willing to give him what he wants. He's eventually going to want to go to Rome. And I'm guessing a part of it is his ability to do so is built up on some of this pre-existing clout. That you owe me one kind of thing. And Paul's really wise about how he uses those things. Again, I think going back to this issue, however, that God, by his design, chose Paul to be a Jewish leader who also happened to be a Roman citizen, makes him uniquely calibrated and uniquely gifted for this kind of like missional moment. And the fact that God arranges all of these things and arranges his people and completely by his design for purposes like this is always super interesting to me, and it makes me more okay with the idea of nobody likes to go through hardships. But when you realize that what God's basic operation is he use whatever context and whatever gifts you're given, whatever hardships you go through to advance his kingdom later on. I think that's always, the sovereignty of God is something cool to meditate on. I checked, I haven't used this illustration yet here.
No, I'll just tell the story about next door.
Oh, go ahead.
So we have a neighbor 2 houses over, who went into he was talking to the neighbors right next door to us out in the yard, went into cardiac arrest, collapsed, and the man who lives right next door, it was very traumatic for him. He's like, I didn't know what to do. I was panicking. I was trying to call like his wife and not call 911. So after this happened, this man and his wife next door took CPR classes. He was like, I don't want to be in this situation again. So I'm a nurse and I'm trained in advanced and like pediatric life support. I have never once been out in the public and been like, oh, someone collapsed, I'm gonna go give them CPR. Okay, so Ben takes CPR next door. He said he was in the grocery store the other day and he thought he saw like a homeless woman sleeping in the aisle, and the manager came over and said, "Don't go down there." And he said, this seems really strange. Is it a medical emergency?" And they said, "We don't know." So because of COVID, I think like no one was even checking to see what was wrong with her. So
Correct.
he went down the aisle, like felt her pulse, didn't feel pulse, started CPR, and then the paramedics. Finally, someone called 911, I guess, and the paramedics came. He was the only one helping this woman. The paramedics came and like she was fine and took her away, but he said she was pregnant. So he's like, I think Jim collapsing next door, I think I saved 2 more people because of what happened. Like, I'm not saying that's why Jim had a heart attack, but maybe that's why he had it out in the yard talking to the neighbors.
Right. So yeah, it's a really. By the way, there's a lot of moving parts there. It's a little hard to follow.
I don't tell stories very succinctly.
Our next door neighbor learned CPR because our neighbor 2 doors down collapsed in front of him a year ago, and he didn't know what to do. And he thought, I need to be more ready to help people out. So he learned CPR. Him and his wife went to some classes, which even that in and of itself is like, wow.
Yeah.
You know,
that's
like
very nice.
Take the time out of our schedule. We're going to go learn CPR because we want God to make us ready for those types of situations in life. Sure enough, a week ago, a woman in a grocery store who happens to be pregnant collapses in the midst of COVID. Nobody wants to go near her, including the EMT that came, I think. That was part of the questioning. Like we can't do CPR right now.
Yeah. And
he performed CPR on her. She revived. And again, he also found out she was pregnant. Didn't know that at first, but like she, how much longer it would have been. She might not have lived. Baby obviously then wouldn't have lived. And he was willing to go the extra mile to learn CPR. He was willing to give CPR to somebody during the COVID crisis because he thought, you know what, if I get this, and even if I die, I have to do the right thing right now, what Christ would do in this moment. And I'm like...
Okay, so what's also interesting is that same day that he saved this woman or maybe it wasn't the same day, but the day he's telling us this story, there were some people that were driving by, and our neighbor 2 doors down, the one who collapsed, owns like this enormous train set. Okay, and there's a sign, you can come see my train set. It's pretty neat to see, but a couple had stopped and they were in the backyard by this huge tree. Okay, so while they're back there, Ben leaves and he goes to the grocery store. A storm came and knocked this enormous tree over, and
huge
immediately, like right where those people were standing, immediately after they left.
Yeah.
So his wife sends him a picture and she's like, oh my gosh, these people were right here that stopped to see the train, like they could have died. So Ben's like, oh, so he comes home and he sees the people, he like passes them, and he said he shouts out his window, God saved your life today.
Yep. Crazy things are happening over at Ben's house is the moral of the story. So number 1, stay out of his backyard. Number 2, he's a good person to have as a
and
neighbor.
the fact that he sees like that he's recognizes like the hand of God in the everyday goings on.
Yes. It's this beautiful combination of preparedness, like concern for others, preparedness, and then so God gives us gifts, but he also expects us to develop faithfully and steward those gifts. So like he had the capacity to learn CPR, but he did have to go and take those classes, and he was willing to do so out of concern for his neighbor. Well, that brought him to just a moment where in the midst of a crisis, everybody else is looking around at each other saying, don't go near that woman. We've got the coronavirus going on. And he says, what are you doing? Like, we need to save her.
Yeah.
And he goes and gives her CPR and she's revived. It's just super, he's great Christian witness, great Christian example. Very cool thing. So.
I think we're a good match for each other because where I bring enthusiasm, you bring...
Dethusiasm.
No, clarity on things. So you can tell a story and get really excited about it, but then you have to retell it in a more normal way. Yeah,
sorry, I don't mean to condescend in summarizing. I hope that's not what it is. Sometimes, I had heard that story already. Like I was there when I heard it, and then as I was listening to you tell it, I was having trouble following. So I thought maybe I need to put this in a succinct fashion.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
It helps.
Okay. Yes, we are a good team. Would you mind closing us with a prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the times and situations that you place us in where we have an opportunity to do what Christ would do and to show your grace to people. I pray that we would, yes, be prepared for those opportunities, but also be looking for those opportunities. Like, where can I help? It's not always like a chance encounter. Sometimes it's someone actually asking you to help, and you have a choice then. Is my time more valuable to me, or is it for other people? Like, do I put other people first? So please help us to look for those opportunities and to also be willing and open to, when those opportunities are presented to us, to be willing to help out. So thank you for this study of the early Christian church. And there's so many examples of people that are willing to sell their property and give all their money to others, and many acts of graciousness, because they're just so thankful for the graciousness that you've shown them. So help us to be more like that. Amen.
Amen. Thanks again for studying with us. We are coming close to the end of the book of Acts, the summary of the early Christian church. So,
and we're going to find out if Paul dies or not, because I still am not sure. / can't remember. / maybe never knew.
He is dead now. I'm going to let you in on that.
Or he's just living on an island with monkeys. We don't know.
And John, yeah. All right, so we'll see you tomorrow for Acts chapter 23.